Thank you all for joining us today. Of course, the Gills Creek Watershed is near and dear to all of our hearts, so I think this is going to be a really fun and educational discussion for everyone. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, or even if you do, the Gills Creek Watershed is among the largest impaired urban watersheds in South Carolina. So you can see there are 3 different, what we call sub-watersheds that make up the one larger Gills Creek watershed. And a watershed, Mark will talk more about that later, but it's an area where all of the rainfall, precipitation, snow on occasion that we have all comes in one area and goes to the same body of water. So all of the water that falls within this one watershed of Gills Creek all goes to the Gills Creek and its tributaries. And so in case you didn't know, Gills Creek actually, its tributaries start above Sesquicentennial State Park and it flows all the way to the Congaree River, just above Congaree National Park. So it really is just massive in terms of covering this area in the Midlands, and it covers 6 different jurisdictions, which makes doing work within it a bit more tricky than if it just covered one. You can see that surprisingly, most people may not know, but a big portion of it is actually on Fort Jackson, and then Richland County encompasses another big portion of it, and then the rest of it is City of Columbia, City of Forest Acres, and then Arcadia Lakes and the City of Casey. So it really is quite large, and it has a lot of different impairments because of the land cover that we've seen. Historically, it was not so developed, and over time it has become much more developed. You can see the dark red is the more developed, higher density areas of Gills Creek currently. And then this green area here is more forested. Much of Fort Jackson remains untouched, which is nice. But you can see along most of Gills Creek watershed, it's very highly developed, and we see a lot of encroachment on the watershed by development, impervious surfaces, that kind of thing. And all of that leads to the impairments that we see in water quality, erosion, which adds sediment to the creek and to all of the lakes that we see within the watershed as well. So that's just a little overview of the watershed. You'll learn more specifically about the different aspects of it as we go through this presentation. But thank you all for putting in the chat why the watershed is important to you. Each of us has our own reason for why the watershed is important to us and why we're here today. But we also wanted to share different information that you may not have thought of before, or just give you a little deeper look into the watershed and why it should be important to you, and the different aspects of it that impact us in our day-to-day lives. So there's 3 different items that we're going to touch on. The first is water quality of the creek, flood protection, and the role that the creek and its tributaries play in protecting us from floods or not, based on the amount of development we've had. And then the third is the critical role of habitat that the watershed plays in our lives and for the other critters that are out there. So the first reason that the Gills Creek watershed is important is the role that it plays in water quality for our area. So Karen Jackson, we're very glad to have her here with us today, is going to discuss this for us. Karen is a water resources scientist with Wood Environmental and Infrastructure Solutions. Her work with Wood includes helping to develop watershed-based plans, assisting municipalities with NPDES permit compliance, and providing stormwater education for the community. She's originally from Illinois, and she has a master's of science in zoology from Southern Illinois University, and has since lived in South Carolina for 7 years. Prior to coming to Wood, she served as a water resource agent with Clemson Extension, and she has sat on the Gills Creek Watershed Association Technical Committee since moving to South Carolina in 2015. So we're very glad to have you here with us today, Karen.
Thanks, Harmony. Yeah, so I feel like I'm going to be the Debbie Downer of the group, but the good thing is I think Harmony's following up with actions Gills Creek is doing to alleviate the issues I'll talk about. So, I just want you to think about, what does water quality mean to you? I think it means a lot of different things to people, whether that's, is the watershed or the waters in the watershed fishable or swimmable? You can go to the next slide, Carmony. Or is it, drinkable with proper treatment? Can you get in it without getting a rash? Can you eat the fish out of that? And is it viewable? Is it pretty? Does it smell okay? That sort of thing. You can go to the next slide. And so it's probably not a surprise that everything we do with water and regulations is driven by the Clean Water Act, which, the main purpose of the Clean Water Act is to protect the integrity of our nation's waters. And the exact wordage you can throw up there, Carmony, but it's really just protecting that integrity. If you want to hit next. So that's at the federal level. At the state level, that's when we get to the Pollution Control Act. And so that basically names DHEC as the agency that's going to be responsible for all the environmental matters. And so that's where these water standards come into play. And so that's just to provide these regulations that ultimately are going to protect and make sure we can still use these waters. So when standards aren't met, the waters go on what's called a 303D list. And so that's just identifying these water bodies that are exceeding standards set by the state. So for example, you'll have dissolved oxygen has to be at a certain level, or else it gets put on the 303D list. And after that, the water has an opportunity to become a TMDL, which is a total maximum daily load, or the watershed can actually become a TMDL. And so that's a plan that actually calculates the maximum amount of a pollutant that can be in that water body before it exceeds the standards. And it's a really robust plan. It talks about, where these pollutants are coming from, how much the pollutant load needs to be reduced for that water body to be okay again. So an example could be how much can that water body have for bacteria. Okay, that's fine, you can go on. So just an overview again, you're starting at the top at the Clean Water Act, which is giving power to the states to go ahead and adopt those water quality standards, get a monitoring plan in place. And, if you get all the way down to the TMDL, you're looking at two different types of pollution. And so that's where point source pollution comes into play. And then non-point source pollution comes into play. And then you can go to the next slide. And so you're probably familiar with this, but point sources are where you have a pipe coming into the river. It's a direct source. The good thing is these are highly regulated. It's really the non-point source pollution that's coming from diffuse sources. It's from you and me and everybody, everything we're doing on land. And that's what, gives us the issues, and that's what's harder to control. And so just real quick, I'll talk about what's going on in Gills Creek in terms of pollutions, and which is mainly non-point source pollution. So starting off, we've got 4 303D listed streams. If you go to that next slide, you can see they're kind of scattered throughout the entire watershed. The next slide shows the TMDL site. So again, those are still impaired. They just kind of have a better idea of the pollutant sources and where it's coming from. And then the next slide shows, the one site in the very lower part of the watershed that's not meeting supported uses. So I believe lead is driving that. So that's the issue there. And then the next slide will show the whole watershed actually has a TMDL, and that's for fecal coliform and dissolved oxygen. And so the next slide shows a table that just summarizes, what's going on, and it actually pinpoints the locations of where the sampling is showing those impairments. And so lead and mercury are really going to be from more point source areas. So mercury is probably from like acid deposition from coal firing plants, who knows where. So a little bit harder to control. I think DHEC is still working on where the lead issues are coming from. And then the dissolved oxygen and that DO, and then fecal coliform is FC. That's probably from, just urban stormwater runoff. Where in an urban watershed, you're going to see these issues. So I'll touch on each of those real quick. So dissolved oxygen.
Oh, that's okay.
So that's a main driver of aquatic health, right? That's like that's huge. If you have a good amount of dissolved oxygen, you know, you're going to have a better chance of having a healthy waterway. It's going to support things like these macroinvertebrates you see here, or fish, which, you know, you're most commonly worried about. You know, it's giving life to aquatic organisms. And so the next slide will show, you know, dissolved oxygen can be impaired by a few different things. Temperature. So when we have warm waters, it's going to hold less dissolved oxygen. So when we've got hot days like this and a rain event comes and stormwater runoff is coming from like an impervious surface, that stormwater can actually be a little bit warmer than what the stream can handle, and it can affect, you know, the dissolved oxygen levels, as well as nutrients. So when we've got nutrients running off of people's lawns, or domestic like animal waste or wildlife waste, adding nutrients in, we're going to have things like the cyanobacteria bloom on the left, or in the middle, the filamentous algal issue you see. And so when that algae die, they're going to consume oxygen as it's being decomposed by bacteria, and using up oxygen. So that's where you see fish kills a lot. And then on the right is just, you know, a bare sediment exposed, you know, along that riparian area. And sediment can actually have adverse effects on dissolved oxygen as well, just because it can actually like attract sunlight and heat up the water, and beyond dissolved oxygen, it fills in, you know, aquatic habitat spaces. So that's definitely a big issue here. That next slide, I'm sure you noticed the cat. So I'm a very big dog person. And a lot of people talk about picking up your dog waste, which is absolutely true. People don't pick up after their pets. It's been shown to get into the river and then go ahead and, you know, create bacterial issues. But there have been some studies, I think maybe over in like the western side of the state, talked about how they were finding, they were doing some bacterial source tracking and finding that feral cats were actually having an impact on water quality. So I threw my boyfriend's cat under the bus here. This is Pippi. She's actually an indoor cat, but I just wanted to make the point that outdoor cats can also contribute bacteria to the waterways. Of course, leaking septic systems or sewer lines can contribute bacteria. I know City of Columbia is doing like a huge upgrade right now. So that's a really great move in the right direction. For failing septic systems, I don't think there's a ton of septic systems in the watershed, but a lot of people might not know that, you know, they need to be maintained and cleaned out every 4 to 5 years. And when that doesn't happen, you can have issues and bacteria can reach the waterway. And then wildlife, you know, as we have a more concentrated a more urban environment and wildlife become more concentrated, that can actually be reflected in bacterial loads. So something to think about. And of course, Canada geese are going to have an impact. I know a lot of people like geese around, but they do have a pretty high virus load in their feces and a lot of bacteria. So do your best to get the Canada geese out of the area, whether it's like Mylar tape, or, you know, let your dogs after them maybe, and just scare them away. Of course, don't let them get them, but if you can scare them off, that'll be good for water quality. But like I said, I'm the Debbie Downer of the group because I talked about, you know, the things that are wrong in the watershed, but there's a lot of great things going on, including what Carmony's about to talk about. So I'm very lucky to be a part of such an active group that, you know, takes a proactive approach and is just on the ball all the time with, you know, resolving some of the issues in the watershed.
Thank you so much, Karen. That was excellent. I did see that somebody had a question, and I completely forgot to say that if you have any questions during the presentation, if you can just put them in the chat, then we'll get to those at the end. But one other item about the Canadian geese, they are around a lot of ponds. We see that happening a lot, and one way to kind of get them to stop doing that is to plant native plants around the edge of the pond. They'll only go in if there aren't, and it's just grass right up to the edge. So that's a good way to address that issue as well. I think Karen might be part of a course that teaches about that information too, or she used to be when she was with Clemson Extension. Yeah. So we, like Karen said, we've been working to improve water quality over the years. One that we did that was way back in 2013 was we actually worked with the Richland School District 2 on plan design of Jackson Creek Elementary School. So there was an immediate concern that the wetlands there might be destroyed, and the possibility of more sediment making its way into Carey Lake. Back in 2010, Carey Lake had been dredged to remove a lot of the sediment. That's a recurring issue there. So After Gills Creek Watershed Association reviewed the preliminary plans, we were able to make several recommendations to make sure that the final plan included low impact development. So anything that was put on the ground was sure to have a very low impact on the watershed in terms of water quality. And then also bioretention swales, which you'll learn about in a second. Pervious pavement, so pavement that allows water to seep through and it treats runoff, stormwater runoff in that way by filtering out the different impairments like E. coli or nutrients, excess nutrients. Enhance native plant communities because they are a lot better for our environment than invasive ones, which you might be surprised you can get invasive plants at your local nursery, unfortunately. And then also that a portion of the wetlands on the site was preserved so that it could not only be protection of Gills Creek Watershed, but also used for an outdoor learning environment for the students. So it was a win-win all around there. And then a second project that we've been involved with is the Owensfield Park installation, where we were able to install different best management practices. And specifically, there were 2 bioretention cells that you can see here. Bioretention cells are landscape depression, so they're purposely made in order to capture and treat stormwater runoff. And so these were made and constructed to be able to capture and infiltrate the first inch of stormwater runoff from the large surrounding parking lots and local neighborhoods before they entered Devil's Ditch and Gills Creek. And so when I talk about that first inch, oftentimes it's called the first flush. So the first inch of rain that comes down is called the first flush, and it contains the largest amount of chemicals. So the bioretention cells have a really big impact because they are able to address that most concentrated level of stormwater runoff. And they've been known to actually reduce the amount of heavy metals in stormwater, or the point source pollution that Karen was talking about, by almost 100%. And then the non-point source pollution, things like fertilizers, by about 50%. So it does have quite a big impact. And then most recently, you all may have seen this project along Croson Road and Divine Street here. We are doing a Gills Creek Stream and Water Quality Improvement Project that should be wrapping up next week or the week after that. So this one we've been doing in conjunction with the City of Columbia and DHEC, with a grant through DHEC and EPA. And not only will this project improve water quality in the area, but it'll also help manage floodwaters, which you'll hear about more soon from Mark. But as you can see here, there's already been a lot of work that has been done in order to improve the stream banks and stabilize them so that the erosion will decrease. Since, like I said earlier, sediment is a huge issue. So this will help decrease erosion and sediment into the stream. And then it'll also help address the stormwater from the surrounding roads and parking lot. This is a very highly developed area, you can see here. So that's very necessary. And then through both of these, the flood waters will have less of an impact, and the stream will also be able to flow in a more natural manner. When you can see these rock cross veins here, this is something that you would naturally see in streams that Gills Creek was channelized and made to be much more straight than the meandering natural creek that it once was. And so being able to install different things like rock cross veins and different things like boulder toes, those are much more natural features that you would see in a creek so that it would flow better and really be able to help address flooding. So definitely go take a look if you're in the area, and this project should be wrapping up soon with some native plantings that'll also help control erosion. And so the second reason Gills Creek Watershed is important is the critical role that the creek plays in terms of its natural floodplain that it has and in reducing flood damage. So Mark Robertson, who's on our board, is going to discuss this for us. Mark worked for the Nature Conservancy, a global nonprofit dedicated to environmental conservation for 34 years. He served as South Carolina State Director for the Nature Conservancy for 23 years. So we are excited to have him talk about this. Thanks, Mark.
Great. Thank you, Carmody. And it's a great pleasure to be here. As mentioned, I am now serving as a board member for Gills Creek Watershed Association, and I'm really impressed with the work the whole organization does to try and improve conditions and maintain what we have at Gills Creek that flows right through several cities here in Columbia. So I'm going to talk a little bit about floodplains and flooding. First off, what is a floodplain? And so this diagram, imagine that you were looking at a stream, whether it was Gills Creek or some other stream, and you took a vertical slice down through the earth, down through the ground, and you sort of had a cross-section cutaway of the stream and the land around it. So you sort of like cut down like through a layer cake, and you're looking at the layers. Imagine you have a very nice layer cake, chocolate icing, vanilla cake, and you cut down a slice through it. That'd be like a cross section through the cake. And here we just have an imaginary picture of a cross section cut down through the land. So what you see here is the idea of a floodplain, and there are two different kinds shown here: the hydrologic floodplain and the topographic floodplain. We don't have to get too much in it, but normally you see when a stream is flowing, like now we're in kind of a dry period. It hadn't rained much in the last few days. So a stream like Gills Creek might be flowing in what you see in the lowest part there, the dark blue. Yeah, thank you, Carmody. That's sort of what we might consider base flow, or scientists would call base flow, which is flowing where there hadn't been a lot of rain, and it's just kind of the amount of water that's always in the creek. So then let's say we get a rainstorm, and we get 2 or 3 inches of rain. Sometimes it's not uncommon to get 5 or 6 inches of rain in a rainstorm here in the summer. And that water has to go somewhere. So as it runs off the land, it's going to go into the creek, and it's going to go up to that next light blue line that Carmody's pointing out, called the bank full elevation. So this is a normal event. People think of floods as being catastrophes, but floods occur in streams all the time, and they're normal events. And the amount of water in a stream is always going to go up and down. And so sometimes it's going to be a tiny little trickle, and other times it's going to be a big stream. So if you get even more rain, the water is going to flow out to the limits called the hydrologic floodplain. So there's 2 lines that kind of show where that goes. And you can see that in this picture, this is a picture of a natural floodplain where there's been no building or development or alterations by people in urban development. And so you see that in this simple diagram, it shows a lot of grasses and trees. That's what's normally in a floodplain. There's a lot of vegetation. There's a lot of areas for wildlife and birds. And the water goes up and down all the time. So sometimes it's wet and sometimes it's dry. Then if you get a really big flood, an unusual event, once every 10 years, once every 100 years, once every 500 years, the water might go all the way outward to these edge called the topographic floodplain. And so basically what this is again, it's a natural event, but what you're seeing is it's a rare natural event when you get a lot of water. And that water, as it runs off the grounds in what we've called the watershed, the area that flows into this stream, it's got to go somewhere. So that's nature's way of creating sort of the storage and flowway for streams, is called the floodplain. Okay, so in this natural floodplain, the water goes up and down. There's a lot of habitat, trees and other plants for fish and wildlife, for otters, for deer, for birds, for wading birds like egrets and herons that we often see around Gills Creek. And so this is a cross-section, an imaginary picture of a typical natural floodplain, where the whole floodplain is still in a natural condition and can do the work that nature intended, which is to store these floodwaters when there's a big storm. And then gradually the waters will go back down. And after a storm, you go back down to the lower levels. So let's go to the next slide, Carmody. So what happens when people come along? Well, sometimes we like to use these areas and build in them for more buildable land. And that's happened a lot in Gills Creek. So here what you see, the 100-year floodplain might be, if we go back one slide, Carmody, the 100-year floodplain would be the same as what's called the topographic floodplain. So go forward again. So that's the biggest, widest area where flooding occurs. And here's called the 100-year floodplain, which is kind of a term that means that, scientists looking at the record of rainfall for these places, in many places we have rainfall records going back more than 100 years, and they can look at the water levels and figure out that, so in a given year, what's the chance of a flood there? And the 100-year floodplain means that there's a 1 in 100 chance every year that you're going to get a flood to that level. So it's a 1% chance. That doesn't sound like much, but over a 20-year period, you're probably going to have a 100-year flood. Yeah, it's a 20% chance. So what happens when people come along? Well, you can see on the left side a little diagram of a bulldozer pushing dirt, and that light tan area with the crosshatch in it with the little lines running through it would be dirt that's brought in to fill in the floodplain. It's called an encroachment because it's encroaching on the floodplain. So you still have the stream down there at the bottom in the stream channel, that's base flow. And then once you filled it in, like shown on the right side, people start building on that. So you have houses and other development on what was the floodplain. So the floodplain is no longer, there's still a couple trees there shown on the far right, but the floodplain is no longer that sort of nice flat area that can store water when a flood happens. Instead, the stream has been it's sometimes called channelized, but it's been pushed into a narrow area. So imagine you might not have a vertical wall on that fill that's there, the crosshatch, but the floodplain has been filled in. Well, the water still has to go somewhere. So when there's a big rainstorm or a hurricane comes by and drops a lot of water on Columbia, like happens not infrequently, that water's still got to go somewhere. And so guess what? It begins to go up, 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 and pretty soon it's flowing out to where it did before under what are called the encroachments. And if someone has built a house there, unfortunately, that creates a lot of problems for people and for the community. And not only that, but by encroaching on the floodplain, we have eliminated all that natural habitat where it's good for fish and wildlife, and it's also good for water quality. Because as Karen pointed out, those floodplains, they act like natural sponges. And as Carmody said, a natural floodplain can absorb pollution and keep the water clean. And we've eliminated it here. So we don't have that natural feature that brings a lot of natural benefits to the stream and the area around it. And unfortunately, that's what's happened to a lot of Gills Creek. Carmody mentioned the project on Croson Road. Well, if you're like me, you don't know where Croson Road is. It's one little road. But think of where Bottles is off Divine Street, or if you're not a customer of Bottles, Marshall's is in that same shopping center. If you go there and shop, if you walk down to the edge of the parking lot and look down, you're looking at Gills Creek. And in that area, Gills Creek looks a lot like this picture. It's been filled in on both sides in the parking lot area where Bottles is and Marshall's, and on the other side where there's other urban development and a road. And so the floodplain there has been pretty much eliminated. It's gone. And it looks a lot like this. And the project that Carmody referred to is an attempt to recreate some of that floodplain and recreate more natural conditions. So this has happened to some big sections of Gills Creek where the floodplain no longer exists. But what happens when we do that? If you go to the next slide, this is what we get. This was 2015. This is a store on Forest Drive called Copeland's. You can probably throw a rock from Copeland's and hit Gills Creek there. And it's built in the floodplain. So the floodplain was filled in here, and it was a real tragedy and problem for this store and for the people who own it, that they were built in the floodplain. The water came up, it had to go somewhere, and this was in the floodplain. So that would be in an area that would be in the prior slide called an encroachment. Yeah.
Okay, dial 800 all sevens.
Hello, I think we're good. Okay. Anyway, we'll go to the next slide. Just a couple other examples. It made some interesting situations. This is on Forest Drive. A kayaker headed down Forest Drive during the 2015 flood. So these areas, many of them were built in what is the floodplain. And so we're putting people in harm's way, and it causes, a lot of damage and tragedy for people when they end up in living or having businesses in the floodplain. So one more slide. So this is down in an area called Timber Lane, right off South Beltline. And this area flooded very badly in the 2015 storm. So after that storm, there were some new houses built there. And as you can see, they were built up on pilings. So they're up off the ground. If you look carefully at these houses, you see that there's actually nothing underneath them except the pilings and the house. Yeah, thank you. The stairs go up to the living area. Well, that's good because it means if there's another big flood, these houses are less likely to flood and be damaged. It's still a problem though, because as shown in this picture, that's still in the floodplain. So this is just kind of a typical rainstorm. This is not a catastrophic, extraordinary event like 2015, but there's still water on the street. So these houses are still in the floodplain. They've been built with building and zoning requirements. They were required to build up that high to get a building permit. And so it puts the living area of the house out of harm's way, but the location is still part of the floodplain. And so we still have to deal with the consequences of that for the people living here and for other people and for the stream itself. And this is part of Gills Creek right along South Beltline, a little not too far from Divine Garner's Ferry Road. So again, the point here is that all streams under natural conditions have a pretty broad, wide floodplain. And that serves a lot of really important natural functions. And what happens is when we develop, we sometimes encroach on that floodplain, fill it in, and then that has a lot of negative consequences for the development and people that end up there. And it can have negative consequences for the stream. So I'm going to stop there, Carmony, and we can move on.
Thank you, Mark. So the third reason that we'll talk about why the watershed is important is natural habitat. And Trish German, who was our past president, will discuss this for us. And she is a former chair of Gills Creek Watershed Association, like I said, who has had a long career focused on environmental policy, including a stint as the executive director of the South Carolina Wildlife Federation, where she developed her appreciation for the role native plants play in the ecosystem. So thank you, Trish.
Thanks. I get to talk about the fun stuff. No Debbie Downer here, and maybe even a little unwarranted optimism. Despite what the ravages of our encroachment on the floodplain have done, despite what our pollution efforts have done, Gills Creek Watershed still provides fairly decent habitat. When you think about habitat, birds and other wildlife need pretty much what we need. They need food, they need water, they need shelter and safe places to rear young. And if you look at this this overhead view, starting up above Sesquicentennial and going all the way down to the Congaree River, there is kind of a green stripe there. It is not as alarming as it looks in the first overview that Carmony shared. A lot of trees. And what's important about that is it provides some connectivity. It makes a corridor that wildlife can pass through. Wildlife's not real good at crossing the street. Birds frequently don't like to cross a wide open area. So Gills Creek Watershed provides a really important area to keep wildlife safe as they move through the area. Next one, Carmony. There are some areas within Gills Creek Watershed that just bowl you over with how beautiful they are, what rich and interesting habitat they provide. And many of them are really inaccessible. So we are deeply indebted to John Grego, who has been willing to slosh through water up to his armpits probably to get some of these pictures for us. But there are areas within Gills Creek Watershed that are just wonderful habitat, and some people who are familiar with both Congaree National Park and the Gills Creek Watershed, the lower areas of the Gills Creek Watershed, have said that really parts of the Gills Creek Watershed could be described as a miniature Congaree National Park, which maybe overstates a little bit, but there's some terrific habitat in there. Go ahead. There are some big surprises. I had no idea until I started getting more involved in this, what all is there. I was talking to a fellow who was fishing down below the dam at Forest Lake, and he said, oh yeah, in the last week or so, he'd caught a couple of bass right there, kind of just off Forest Drive. Otters, Bob Askins, who takes a lot of pictures for the Gills Creek Watershed Association, has got some wonderful pictures of otters playing behind Trenham Plaza back there where the dumpsters are and where the post office parks its trucks. There are otter there. There are otters and beavers, both that have been seen within the last year by residents who are down in the Timberlane area that Mark just talked about. And I wish I could take credit for this eagle picture, but I will tell you that I saw an eagle looking exactly like that this spring. We were doing a cleanup, and it happened to be on the same day as the big backyard bird count, or whatever it's called. So I stopped collecting litter and looked at birds for 15 minutes and looked up and said, my word, that looks like an eagle. And I pulled up my binoculars, and darned if it wasn't an eagle. Just flying around right above the intersection of Decker Boulevard and Trenham Road, right around Dent Middle School. So we've got really rich and interesting things in the watershed, as well as some more typical residents on the next slide. You know, these are the things that catch your eye when you look out the window: the chickadees, the cardinals, the blackbirds playing. The pileated woodpecker is all over our watershed. It's a little more difficult to see. And for anyone who's not familiar with the pileated woodpecker, oftentimes people think that when they've seen it, they've seen the red cockaded woodpecker, because they hear about the rare red cockaded woodpecker. They haven't seen a pileated very often. They think this is red cockaded because it has a red cockade, but no, it's not. Go ahead, Carmody. One of the things, we see a lot of raptors within the watershed. This is a red-tailed hawk. I think we've certainly seen a lot of red-shouldered hawks, lots and lots of owls. One of the wonderful things about all these raptors is they keep the rodent population down. We also see a lot of the wading birds, egrets, great blue herons, that sort of thing. And one of the really exciting spots within the Gills Creek watershed is a big heron rookery that is, again, off Timberlane that Mark described. It is sort of out there in the soggy area with South Beltline on one side and the Hamptons on the other side. Again, Bob Askin's photo, he has an incredible lens and has taken some truly wonderful pictures. But the heron are just about fledging right now. And at the beginning of the season, if you're down there at dusk, you can see sometimes 3 or 4 heron per tree just standing there like sentries around their nests. It's really exciting. Again, very valuable habitat most people don't know about. One of the extremely important values of the Gills Creek watershed is to provide a resting spot for migratory birds. The one on the left there is a female or immature indigo bunting. It's on its way back up here from Central America. The middle bird is a female rose-breasted grosbeak on her way up to colder parts of the United States. And on the far right is a golden crowned kinglet who goes all the way up to Canada. So if you're coming from Central America on your way to Canada and you look down and you see this big green blob that's got trees and water and food, you know, you're going to stop. So it's really important to maintain the habitat value within the watershed. Next slide. How we maintain that is through plants. Particularly native plants, because native plants provide food for insects, and insects provide food for birds and other wildlife. The native plants have evolved in concert with the native insects and the native birds and wildlife over millennia. And so if we keep the native plants, we're providing good food for everybody. Remember, bugs equals bird food. If we replace those plants with non-natives, camellias, azaleas, many of those things we love, as well as things we don't love so much, like the privets and Chinese wisteria and some of those kind of plants, we are not providing the food for insects that the birds need. So it's really, really important to do what you can in your own yard to get rid of the invasive plants that don't provide much wildlife value and replace them with natives. We've got a spot on our website that talks about native plants. It has a downloadable flyer that you can keep with you, that if you've got a particularly obnoxious, invasive, non-native, here's a good substitute for it in your landscape, and some photos of native plants in the landscape. Go ahead. The other thing about the undeveloped areas of the watershed that we tend to forget is that even as plants are dying, even as they are decomposing, they are providing food for insects. So we don't want things to be too cleaned up. And if you've got a place in your yard where you can leave a dead tree for a while or some decomposing stumps, that's wonderful food for insects, which again is food for birds. Go ahead. Carmody talked about some of the projects that Gills Creek has been involved with. This is another fairly recent project down in the Timberlane area. What Mark showed were some houses that were actually there during the flood and survived the flood. But if you keep on going on Timberlane, the entire road where the red arrow there is has been condemned, and all but a few of the houses have been removed. And what we have done is work with Richland County, with the City of Columbia, and with the Central Carolina Community Foundation to develop a plan for turning that area, which is still looks pretty rough and devastated, into a very useful and attractive community resource. As we've already said, it's rich in bird species. There's the heron rookery down there. Lots and lots of reptiles, amphibians, mammals. My son lives close by there and walks his dog down there. And on a normal rainy day, often the water will cover the road, and he will send me a picture of a turtle swimming in the middle of the road or something like that. And again, to emphasize, it's that big green blob that provides a potential pathway for critters to go from Timberlane up through the Divine Street corridor and on up into the lakes areas, and ultimately farther on up to Sesqui. So it's really, really an important project, and we believe it's going to provide a lot of interesting volunteer opportunities, and we are hopeful that among the partners working on this, we'll be able to find funding to create some trails and provide the educational signage that will help people understand how important this area is for the watershed, and how important similar areas within the watershed are for our overall well-being. And of course, finally, if you've got good habitat, you're also doing what you can to mitigate flood damage, because you're keeping the floodplain forested as it needs to be. And of course, vegetated floodplains filter out pollutants, so you are also mitigating some of the water quality problems that Karen talked about. And I think that takes us up to questions. Is that right?
Trish did speak about the natives and invasives section in that little informational sheet, so I put that link in the chat for anybody who's interested. So feel free. I didn't see any questions that have already come in the chat, but if anybody has one, just put those in the chat and we will answer those. And in the meantime, so everybody has this information. If you'd like to get involved with Gills Creek Watershed Association and any of the projects that we're doing, or any volunteer opportunities, you can become a member. I just put the direct link for that into the chat as well, so you can have easy access to that. But become a member, you'll be signed up for a big splash email list, which will have all the different information about the projects that we're doing, different volunteer opportunities, different events. One that's coming up is this Saturday, it's Sweep the Acres with Forest Acres. They're doing just a big cleanup within the whole watershed and specific areas along the creek that we'd love to have anybody who's interested in cleaning up the watershed come and help with that. There's also going to be a cookout afterwards, so that'll be fun. And we have other webinars like this that we do about once a month. We'll have different events like bird walks that JCAC with the South Carolina Wildlife Federation's done along Timberlane, where we've seen over 40 different bird species, some of which Trish talked about. So we have a lot of different things going on. We'd love for you all to get involved. And there are different ways that you can also lessen your impact on the watershed that you can find out about on our website, but things like not using fertilizers, or if you do, don't use them right before a rain event, because you can see how that will end up in our water. So if anybody has any questions, I haven't seen any come in, but thank you all so much for attending, and thanks to our
Carmody,
students.
I'm sorry, let me, because I was just answering Karen's note about the fabulous pictures and you know, giving a tip of the hat to Bob and John Grego and Joe Long, who also have taken pictures. Let's talk a little bit more about the volunteer opportunities, because I think, you know, the easy, obvious one is picking up litter, but we need people to take pictures, and we need people to, I think, help with social media to get the word out about things. If you've got some sort of a special talent that is, you know, a very specific one-time thing, please let Carmody know that you can do whatever it is. I think we will be needing a lot of assistance with sort of natural gardening kinds of projects. We're going to be pulling invasives out of the Timberlane area. We're going to be probably planting some native plants in several different spots. So there are lots and lots of ways to get involved. And we probably need to be more creative in thinking about how to publicize those opportunities.
Yes, good point. Thank you, Trish. And all of those that will be coming up, they will be put in the newsletter. And then we also have several committees, like Karen's been on the technical committee. We also have education committee that we would love to have new members on. And the technical committee, like Tom just put in there, we do have volunteer opportunities for anybody who wants to do water quality monitoring. If you go to Gills Creek or any of its tributaries, or you know, would love to start doing some water quality monitoring, we always need volunteers for that as well, and we can get you set up with that. So we have tons of different opportunities. If you'd like to be involved and you don't really know how yet or what specifically, then feel free to just shoot me an email and we can figure out what would be the best fit for you there. Okay, well, that looks like all. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Like I said, if you'd like to get involved or have any additional questions, you can shoot me an email or any of our presenters today too. So thank you all so much for attending and for supporting the work that we do, and for caring about the watershed, because we couldn't do our work without you all. So thank you so much.